First, it goes back to those that you put in those seats in the first place, like making sure that they're really passion and mission aligned before they earn that seat there. So again, keeping the higher bar really high. Second is the way you structure those debates. If it has the rigor where we've really looked at everything from every angle, we have the data that, often in entrepreneurship, we don't have all the data we wish we had. But if we've gathered all the possible data and we've fleshed out like pros and cons of each, once a decision's been made, everyone should really understand the premise.
Much for making the time to come on the podcast. I was just saying before we hit record that my partner is a huge fan of yours, and you were on her podcast, and I hear about you all the time. So to get the opportunity to finally speak, I'm super excited.
A pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
No, thank you. And like as I said in my intro, you have an incredible career, incredible kind of background, and I'd love to start actually with a really high level question, right? Which is, as a former chief of staff to Google, Amazon, some of the biggest companies in the world, what does being a chief of staff mean to you?
It seems like a simple question, but it's a really difficult one to answer because every single chief of staff role is a little bit different. So my answer to this will be different from anyone else's. But since you asked what it means to me, my favorite part of the job was being an intellectual sparring partner for these CEOs, which was oftentimes terrifying because they are among the smartest people in the world, but also something that like is my own personal business school and taught me to think like they do and to ask the questions they would ask and really merge my nature, which is a little bit more timid and more measured, with their nature of tech, and to really kind of build some new instincts and skill sets that have served me well. So I would say to me, chief of staff is really around the merging of strategy and operations, where I'm partnering with a CEO to execute their vision in the day-to-day so that they can stay firmly focused on the long-term horizon. And that is my favorite part of the job, is getting to reverse engineer their moonshot goals and think about, okay, what are the 100 manageable steps between here and where they want to be, and what do we need to accomplish today in order to qualify for that end result? So it was a very big job and thrilling and terrifying all at once.
It sounds it. I can imagine it being all wrapped in when you start breaking those things down. I mean, how, because you were the chief of staff with Jeff Bezos, Marissa Mayer, Eric Schmidt. I'd love to know, in like difference of opinion or different styles, how did they approach the big innovation that they had? Was it always very kind of vision-led, dream, listening to the team, or was actually, it was more detailed orientated? Like, how did they actually like to approach, the big leaps in innovation that they then push?
I mean, each of them have wildly different personalities. So that definitely comes through in their management style. But there's also common denominators between how each of them could be wildly effective in designing a new future. So when I worked for Jeff, I wasn't chief of staff. It was my first job after undergrad. So I watched Andy Jassy, who had the official title of the Shadow. But in effect, Andy Jassy was his chief of staff. And I modeled the rest of my career after how I saw Jeff Bezos and Andy Jassy interact. The role of the Shadow that Andy had been hired to do was really to have that umbrella perspective of the whole organization, because all of the rest of Jeff's direct reports were heads down in inventing a future that none of us had experienced yet. It was the dawn of the internet. And he really just had to hire people who were wildly smart and could teach themselves to do anything, because we couldn't hire people for the skill set we needed because no one had ever done this before. We were inventing e-commerce. And so what I saw Andy do for Jeff was that intellectual sparring partner, that poking holes in all his favorite ideas, challenging all his ideas, helping him think through things 5 layers deeper, to be honest, like 100 layers deeper than most people would ever go. And so the rest of my career, I tried to do that when I was partnering with my execs, is help them anticipate and to really be very, very proactive in my role for them and making them the most effective executives they could be
Yeah.
And the way in which the three of them were really similar, even though they're very different in personality, is the team element. They were
Okay.
very, very careful. They had an extremely high bar for hiring across the entire organization, but especially their leadership teams who would be working side by side with them.
Yeah.
And that is something that I really admire. They not only tolerated but demanded to be challenged by their teams,
Yeah.
and that is how they became as successful as they are. Well, all three of them are wildly smart,
Yeah.
incredibly intuitive, creative, innovative by
Mm.
nature. Having that executive team that was at that same level and where all of our time was spent around debate. That is
Mm.
something that after leaving Amazon and Google after 15 years, I realized was not present at that Olympic level in most organizations. So now with my CEO consulting clients, that's one of
Mm.
the first things we work on is number one, do we have the right people in the right seats? This is the
Yeah.
quality and caliber of talent you need to be able to execute your vision.
Yeah.
And two, are we utilizing them in the best way? Because most executive meetings, honestly, are like weather reports. It's
Yeah.
just reporting on what we've already done or talking about the problems that are underfoot today.
Yeah.
However, what we really need to be spending our time in is debating, anticipating, really thinking about the disruptions that are in front of us and then creating action plans around it. So I've really tried to adopt that common practice among my CEO execs and pay that forward to the next generation of entrepreneurs.
It's super interesting. The word debate
Mhm.
specifically, how do you hire for that? Because I can't imagine going through an interview process and being encouraged to debate with the CEO, especially of the caliber of the people that you've worked with. So how did you find those CEOs and those leaders actually test for that and assess that?
They're looking for patterns of surviving some very painful failures or setbacks. So in Silicon
Mm.
Valley, we celebrate our failures. And the reason we do that is because it accelerates your learning so much. You learn so much more from a painful setback or
Yeah.
disappointment than we often do in our wins.
Yeah.
There's also ways that we can learn more from our wins. Not enough people do like postmortem reports or reviews over their successes,
Yeah.
whereas we overanalyze every tiny detail of all of our failures. So there's ways to overcome that. But the truth is it really accelerates our learning. So that was something that we would look for as a track record of overcoming setback and disappointment.
Yeah.
Two, we're looking for patterns of grit and
Mm.
intelligence, where again, we're looking for people who can teach themselves to do anything. So
Yeah.
that's a real challenge for hiring executive teams now because tech has been around for a few decades now, which was not a luxury we had when I started my career. You can have wildly successful people who have actually just been taught one particular playbook, but
Yeah.
that's not what I am looking for when I'm looking for an executive hire. I really want to see someone who's taught themselves to do something. For example, one of my favorite interview questions that I use now is I ask someone, please tell me about a goal you've set for yourself that took more than 1 year to accomplish.
Mm.
That is not an appropriate question for any role, but for an executive team where I'm looking for somebody with grit and ambition and intelligence, that will tell me a lot about you. That will tell me, one, are
Yeah.
you the type of person that even sets goals like that?
Yeah.
Two, for sure, if you've accomplished that goal, you had setbacks and disappointments. You've had to seek out, discover, and utilize mentors. You've had to invent playbooks, overcome setback, injuries, failures.
Yeah.
You learn a lot through someone's response. And so
Yeah.
that's the type of experience that matters the most, much more so than did you go to an Ivy League school or do you have a
For sure.
20-year career at an already established tech giant? That's really what I'm looking for if I'm hiring an executive into a company that's trying to disrupt or do anything innovative.
Yeah, again, incredibly interesting, and I'm thinking about it from the founders and the startup founders that I meet on a daily basis, and
Hmm.
yeah, I ask a similar question around it. It's something a pursuit that eludes you. I would love to be a
Mm.
world pro, a world pro tour cyclist, but that's never going to happen, unfortunately. And it's the same, I guess, the same principle. So,
Yeah.
and focusing on those three leaders again from as the business is scaled and as they grew, especially let's take Amazon for example, because you were there early, you saw the business grow, you were
Hmm.
trying to do things that hadn't been done before. How did the leadership style change as the business also changed, right? As the business grew and you start thinking more about culture, actually selling teams individual culture, and then you start having other products and different geographies, how do you make it replicable, and, how does it become an Amazon culture, right? Or do you say,
Mhm.
no, actually, we need to have different cultures, and that's the best way of breeding success amongst the team?
Amazon is a great case study of this, and it's not one that I think you can just slap that playbook onto any organizational work. It's very
Mm,
reflective of kind of the temperament of Jeff and the goals that he was setting for himself. But I think it's an interesting playbook in how to do that for yourself and create something that's very special and reflective of your values
mm,
and how that ties to the passion and the mission of your organization. When I first started at Amazon in 2002, this was a moment of influx. This is why I love consulting for scaling organizations, because that was the moment of time where I came into
yeah,
Amazon and into Google. They were just finding that fit that led to their market
yeah,
dominance. And when I joined Amazon, Jeff was realizing that he needed to replicate his leadership style and decision making
mm,
because he could no longer be in every room where
yeah,
really important decisions were being made. So he decided to create a couple of processes that allowed them to scale as if he could be in every room.
mm,
The first was among the now famous Amazon leadership principles.
mm,
So one of the first projects that I collaborated with his senior leadership team is called the S team. I worked with the S team. 3 members had been assigned to really document
yeah,
the principles and the barometers, the instincts by which important decisions should be made. So they drafted what became the original 10 leadership principles of Amazon around, for example, frugality, debate, healthy disregard for the impossible, those kind of things.
mm,
And over time, that evolved. So those original 10 principles, while they still remain, they've added to it. So then it became 14. And then when Andy Jassy, who had been that chief of staff shadow role, became, 19 years later, was made Jeff's successor as CEO, Andy added 2 more. So now there are 16. So I think
yeah,
it's one thing that's really important when you're setting this is first to document it in the beginning of how are we making important decisions,
yeah,
especially when often if you're doing anything innovative, you're not choosing between good and bad. You're choosing between 3 possible paths
yeah,
forward, and you're not sure which is which. So helping people empower your team members to make those decisions
mm,
by documenting your decision making is really important. But two, very few organizations, once those principles or values or mission are set,
yeah,
reevaluate it and update it and allow it to pivot and have a life of its own. And so I think that doesn't get enough attention that Amazon did that actually in 3 cycles over their 20-year history so far.
yeah,
Um, and then the second thing that Amazon did, which was really important, kind of goes back to my answer to your first question, which was how do they make decisions? How do
yeah,
you infuse into your culture this insatiable curiosity and willingness to disrupt yourself? And that really
mm,
comes down to spending time debating, anticipating, rather than being reactionary or solving the problems that are already underfoot. And Amazon does that through a very academic process that is now called 6-page memos. Every meeting, in advance of the meeting, you're really writing down an academic proposal. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's what the definition of success is. These are the possible courses of action, pros and cons of each, and you make a recommendation. You
yeah,
send that to your peers, everyone who's going to be in the meeting. They read that in advance and come with hard hitting research questions.
yeah,
Because the way most organizations do their meetings is they have some kind of vague agenda and it just becomes kind of weather reports of what I did this week.
mm,
Or you get kind of the best ideas that come to you in the moment.
yeah,
And then you only hear the people who love to hear themselves talk and it's not necessarily rigorous
yeah,
researched and thought through ideas. So those are a couple of systems I've see replicable
yeah,
in different organizations that allow you to have your own personality, your own culture come through, but provide much better insights and results.
yeah.
But I could talk for hours about this. This is this is what I get really nerd. I love to nerd out around people and operational systems because I
Yeah,
just get so excited. There's so much more we can glean
yeah,
and make you much more efficient with your time and lead
yeah,
you to better results much faster. And it really, this is the heart of what I love about my job.
yeah. We could talk for hours. That's fine. We
Okay,
could we could
great.
record away. That's totally fine. I
This
mean,
will be a 10-part series. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Multiple
Yeah.
episodes with Anne. I think so. One thing I'm really interested in here is how can early stage founders take these learnings and these lessons, right? You're starting off, it's all hands on deck, right? I mean, you know
Mhm.
yourself, like it's
Mhm.
chaos. So these
Yep.
processes are obviously iterative as the business scales and as it grows. But what are the core foundations? Like if I said to you, okay, what are the 1, 2, or 3 things that every early stage founder should do as they're setting up right at the very beginning to think about, yeah, internal operations, the communications, the culture, all of those really key points that will determine the trajectory of the business.
First is around hiring. Like,
Mm,
decide what is your bar for talent, what is the right kind of fit. And I don't mean looking overly emphasizing culture fit, because then we accidentally get these silos of like everyone has the same background,
yeah,
comes from the same school, etc. You don't want
yeah.
that, because we all know the correlation between diversity of thought and experience and exceptional results.
Mm,
So, but what I mean by that is what type of person enjoys working here? Who is effective here? Are these extreme risk takers? Are we creatives? Are we,
mm,
whatever it is that common denominator that is at the heart of where your individual personal passions align with the organizational mission. So
yeah,
getting really, really clear on that intersection and using that as an equally important score on your hiring system as skill set
yeah.
is. Not enough organizations articulate that early enough. They
Mm,
just hire their friends and they hire the smart people. And then when
yeah,
you get this inflection point and you're just on a rocket ship, you often lower your standards and you just
yeah,
need, warm bodies and seats just to keep the lights on. And that's where many, many organizations make a mistake, and it's
yeah,
really hard to undo. That's very expensive, and it will slow you down.
yeah,
So keep that hiring, establish a very clear hiring bar, and then never lower your standards. I
yeah,
know it's easier said than done.
yeah,
The second would be document decision making. So way before you think you need it, write down those playbooks, because by the time you need it written down, it's when you have so many people that you no longer can have
yeah,
everyone in a single conference room or have a single conversation. And so you need to document that before you need it so that you
yeah,
can just have these playbooks and have it updated in real time. That's another thing that's very, very painful for all my scaling CEOs to be like, I don't
yeah,
know, how do we get this out of so and so's head and written down into a
yeah,
system? And
yeah,
that will serve you well if you document before you need it.
yeah,
And then the third is having really clear moonshots. Like, where are we going with this? Not Jeff called this avoiding short-termism. Like, don't set
mm,
milestones too close to you. It's really tempting to do, especially if you're taking VC money or investment, even
yeah,
angel investment, because you want to give your investors a return as quickly as possible. But often that's not in your or their best interest. And the way Jeff ran early Amazon is a great case study of this, where, if you remember, Amazon was one of the very few organizations to survive the dot-com bust of the early
yeah,
2000s. And so when I joined the company, we were not yet profitable, and every single one of our investors had lost all of their other investment money. Like, trillions of dollars had disappeared out of the economy overnight. They
mm,
wanted that back, and they wanted it now. Jeff refused to set short-term goals like that. In fact, his sweet spot has always been around a 7-year return on a big
wow,
idea, because if it's he's able to accomplish it faster than that, it's too small. It's actually
mm,
not the big win that creates big long-term value. So 7-year horizons tend to be his sweet spot. But obviously, I mean, he's literally Amazon's doing things now that I know for a fact were created in its infancy back when I was at the company 15 years ago. So don't be too tempted by the early wins,
yeah,
because that can really cannibalize your long-term opportunities. And Jeff, over his tenure, experienced a lot of ups and downs. Like, there was an article he literally had framed in our office. It was written by Barron's, where the headline was Amazon dot bomb.
yeah,
And this was written in, like, I think April of 99. Jeff framed it because he wanted to use that as motivation to be like, I will show you. But
yeah,
in the short term, they were not wrong. Over the next 2 years, Amazon lost 71% of their share value. It
mm,
was painful. That's when I joined, was right
yeah,
then, and we were at the bottom of that curve. But over Jeff's tenure as CEO, he had a 12,431% return on shareholder value.
incredible,
So sometimes it takes that long to
yeah,
have your vision come to life, but don't be
yeah,
tempted by the short-term results. That's really hard,
yeah,
because as Jeff likes to say, if you're doing anything new or innovative, you have to be willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time.
for
And
sure,
likes that feeling. Even
Yeah.
Jeff, nobody likes that feeling. But if you can use that as motivation and keep your eye on that North Star, it will serve you really well.
Yeah, specifically on that point, and we were talking earlier about sitting on
Mhm.
this side of the table, the investor side of the table. And I'm going to go back on the other side of the table now and say, how did Jeff in particular, how did he actually communicate to investors that you got to trust me? I've got this 7-year vision in this
Mhm.
case. We're going to get there. These are the things that we need to happen, especially when investors, as you say, they're pushing back and they're saying, we want the returns now. We want this to be short horizon. Like, how do you actually manage that? I find that quite
Yeah.
an interesting question.
Yeah, he was one of my favorite ways he did that was through his annual shareholder letter, which are
Mm,
now famous, like literally studied in business schools. Nobody really did that back then. Like no one
yeah,
was authoring a shareholder letter. So he
yeah,
wanted each investor to feel like they had a personal relationship with him and his strategy. And he did
mm,
that by authoring those himself. I mean, he had all kinds of communications people writing all kinds of things
of
for him.
course.
That was penned by him every time because it was such a personal element of his leadership.
Yeah,
And that was something that I really appreciated that was similar at Google. When Larry Page, the co founder of Google, wrote their original IPO letter, he
yeah,
wrote in it, Google is not a conventional company and we do not intend to become one.
yeah.
And that was a signal to our investors, both on that day of the IPO and after, don't expect this is not for day traders. This
Mm,
here, we're building for long-term growth. We're going to see a lot of ups and downs. We're going to take some big swings,
yeah,
and that's not going to deter us because we just learned from that and we're going to use that data and information. We're going to do better tomorrow. And
yeah,
so both Amazon and Google signaled very, very early this is not for short-term
yeah,
investors. This is for if you want a seat on a rocket ship, like you're welcome here, but we're going to do things differently.
yeah,
And so I think both organizations put a personal face on that and really brought their shareholders along with them. However, on the other side of that, doesn't mean we had an easy time of it.
of course.
Especially at Amazon, we had a board that was legally bound to represent that shareholder and encourage us to get them a return on that. That was their legal responsibility. And they absolutely had very, very heated board meetings until we were turning a profit because we had a responsibility to people who had trusted us with
Yeah,
with their investments. And especially in early internet, this was a really crazy thing for most people to put their hard-earned money behind. And so yeah, those board meetings were tough. They
yeah,
did their duty. But it was important for Jeff to show his vision and do a process that we call show the math. When we're
yeah,
doing long-term risk taking, there's some factors in this equation that are knowns,
yeah,
and then there's elements of things that we don't know because this is a business model or an emerging technology that no one's ever utilized before. And so there's inherent risk involved. But once we could show the math as much as possible and then make the case for how we were going to solve for X,
yeah,
that's where you get some leash to do some, new and innovative things that are
yeah,
sometimes terrifying and sometimes don't work out.
for sure.
But that's how you help your board of directors and your shareholders understand where you're going and give you leeway enough to
Yeah.
give it the possibility of life.
Yeah, I can only imagine what those board meetings were like.
It crazy. Yeah.
Incredibly insightful. And
Mhm.
I want to draw it back to the chief of staff role. And you said earlier,
Mhm.
you were a sparring partner. You were there through those really tough decisions.
Yeah.
Lots of innovation. Were there times that you personally felt like any one of the CEOs that you worked with where they were wrong and that they were making a wrong decision? And
Mhm.
actually, you explored all opportunities. You'd really debated this long, but you'd come to a position where they thought they were right. You thought they were wrong. They went ahead and executed anyway, and good outcome, bad outcome. How did that play out?
I'm sure there's a million of these. I mean, the hardest part of my job was I was really there to speak truth to power. Because
Mm,
once you have a track record, especially of these now celebrity CEOs that I work
yeah,
for, is they are hyper aware, thank goodness, that the real danger is that suddenly they're surrounded by people who
yeah,
think that all their jokes are funny and all their ideas are great. And my job was to make sure that never happened, to
yeah,
make sure that we were asking the hard questions, that we were aggressively analyzing their path forward. So this was a big part of my job is to
yeah,
challenge them and be like, and there were I'm sure I can't think of a big example, but there were definitely moments where I was just like, I don't think this is the way to accomplish it.
Mm,
I was lucky enough to always work for executives whose vision I was 100% aligned with.
yeah.
The end goal, this big moonshot thing that we were trying to accomplish, was something
Yeah.
I equally believed in, and it was aligned with my passions and the change I wanted to see in the world. So I
Okay.
never felt any kind of core underlying conflict. The way in which we were going to accomplish that, occasionally we had different visions for how to
Yeah.
do it. One simple example would be Eric Schmidt was as CEO of Google. He attended the World Economic Forum in Davos every
Mm,
year, and I remember it was like his 20 something time of going to this meeting, and he came back being like, "Oh, I'm gonna die if I have to go to this thing one more time." It's the same old guys talking about the same old things,
mm,
the same old room, and he just felt like the needle wasn't moving forward. So he had this idea. He wanted to create kind of a small Davos inspired conference that would make a change, where we could innovate and accelerate really important changes in the world much faster. And so he wanted to purposely have a very diverse group of people there. We were going to work on particular types of issues. So when we assembled the guest list for the very first session, I actually didn't think it represented diversity in all of its complexities. While we
mm,
had people of different seniority and backgrounds and ethnicities and geographies and stuff, I actually challenged him to say, I know the major goal of this was to put together um, more diversity of thought. They are all
mm,
very similar in personality. And I didn't feel like we had that kind of multi-dimensional approach to the world.
yeah.
And after the first year, I think we both decided I was right. And we made some pivots because
Yeah.
it really changes the dynamic of a
Yeah.
conversation when you have so many people of a similar personality type. We did a great job in the other definitions of diversity, but there was some opportunity to have more cohesion and partnerships and kind of natural effects after the event
Yeah.
that the following years were much more effective. I think that's always happens though, right? The first
Yeah.
iteration of anything isn't going to be, its best form.
For sure.
But there's small things like that,
Yeah.
where we were fully aligned on the vision, the way in which we were going to execute that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we had differing opinions, but that was my job, was to speak my piece and give them all the
Yeah.
data backed up to challenges I could.
Yeah.
And then it was up to them,
Yeah.
even if they disagreed with me, then I was both feet in. I was like, I was going to fully execute on that.
Yeah.
And that's also another challenge I see with some of my execs is when they have hired people who will challenge them,
Yeah.
sometimes it can be difficult to then get them, once a decision has been made, to be fully,
Mm,
completely 100% committed
mm,
to making that vision a success. And if it doesn't work, then we all pivot together, but you need everyone to have both
yeah.
feet in.
But what advice would you give an exec in that situation where team might be divided, right? How do you actually grow out? How do you actually motivate individuals to not to get them back on board? Because everyone has differing opinions, as you say, and that's totally fine. I think that's good for innovation and culture. But how do you get those individuals to turn up every day, put the energy in that's required if they feel like there's just a different way of getting to the same destination?
I think first it goes back to those that you put in those seats in the first place, like making
Mm,
sure that they're really passion and mission aligned before they earn that seat there. So
yeah.
keeping the higher bar really high. Second is the way you structure those debates. If it has the rigor where we've really looked at everything from every angle, we have the data that, often in entrepreneurship, we don't have all the data we wish we had. But
Yeah.
if we've gathered all the possible data and we've fleshed out like pros and cons of each, once a decision's been made, everyone should really understand the premises and the bets upon which this decision has been made. Because I find when you notice an executive having one foot out, it's usually because they don't believe the academic rigor has been given net
Mm,
necessary for that
yeah.
for that bet that you're making. So making sure you have a very thorough debate process helps prevent a lot of that. And then we can have differing opinions. So the third fail-safe that I would suggest is making sure that you treat these decisions as experiments rather than a one-way door decision. Jeff
Yeah.
used to love to describe this as one-way doors versus two-way doors. Almost no decisions you're making are a true one-way door where we can't come back from this. You bet the
Yeah.
farm all in. If this doesn't work, we're dead. That happens sometimes, especially in startups. But most decisions are not that. Most decisions are two-way doors. If we go through this door and it doesn't have the intended result, we can circle back and try door number 2 and door number 3.
Yeah.
However, you really need to call out in advance before you go through the door, here's how we're going to judge if this was correct for us or not. I call these your green light indicators and your red light indicators. If this was the correct path, we should expect to see X, Y, and Z results happening within the
Yeah.
first month, quarter, year, whatever it is. If this was not the right decision, here's the red flags we should look out for. We're going to see this happen, this start to break, this, whatever. And that means we'll circle back and we're going to try door number 2.
Yeah.
When you articulate that in advance, people are willing to run full speed through the door because they're like, we're not going to get like 10 miles down the road and realize we made a huge mistake. We're going to notice it right away because we know what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And so I think when those 3 things are aligned, you get much more buy-in, especially when you're doing really risky things. And we're in an environment right now where everything's being disrupted and turned upside down.
For sure.
So this is even more important, even if you don't feel like you're, at a particularly risky strategy part of your organization. But not enough people call those red flags or green flags out in advance. And I think that's essential for optimizing for speed.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I want to go back to just the point around diversity of thought and diversity around the table, because I read a story once about Eric Schmidt. When he traveled, he would have these dinners and different people would come along, and he'd invite people from totally different backgrounds to come and debate or talk about something that was interesting. Well, got the question there that I have is, if you're a solo founder, if you're a startup founder, maybe there's 2 of you, how do you cultivate something like that, right? You don't have the same black book as Eric probably does or does have. So how can you start building in these little habits to challenge your thought process and actually make sure that you are getting differing opinions and, from totally different perspectives?
So I ran those dinners for Eric for for a decade.
Yeah.
It was among my favorite things I ever got to do because I had the
Cool.
privilege of meeting the smartest, most interesting people in the world whenever we were in a new city. And I tried to replicate that when I left. And so I want to acknowledge it's harder when you're not Eric Schmidt. So, for
For sure.
example, I tried to do a dinner like that when I spoke at South by Southwest the year after I left Google.
Yeah.
And not being Ann from Google is a very different invitation.
Yeah.
And so it can be hard to get people to come. So one, it takes time to build up that reputation and Rolodex, especially if you're reinventing yourself. So give yourself some grace there.
Yeah.
But 2, there are line upon line ways that we can build this for ourselves, even in a period of reinvention. So social scientists call this the difference between strong ties and weak ties. Someone who's a strong tie is, for example, somebody you went to school with. They probably have a similar socioeconomic background, probably look similar to you, come from where you come from,
Yeah.
likely a similar religious background. All those kind of things are probably you have a lot overlapping in your Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
However, weak ties are people who have very little in common in terms of background and culture and et cetera. For example, think of going to a sporting event. The person sitting next to you is supporting the same team or at minimum interested in the same sport.
Yeah.
But where they come from, what they studied, what they do in life, their culture, their background, like that's likely has much less overlap in your life Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
And so cultivating and seeking out those weak ties really enriches your understanding of the world, getting to know different expertise, different personalities, risk tolerances, those kind of things. Many of us, especially now with social media and the algorithm just feeds this to us, people who think like we do, value what we value, come from where we come from. So we really have to be very purposeful in getting outside of those silos and seeking out difference, especially difference of thought and perspective, of values, et cetera, and having really rich conversations around those areas of disconnect. I think so many of us are really afraid of exploring that because, we're worried of there's only black or white and not finding gray. But I think those are the richest conversations that I've ever had is people who just have a wildly different world experience than mine. But you really have to cultivate that. You have to create space for that. And that probably leads to the next element or differentiation that I see between the execs I work for and the execs I'm consulting now is creating space for that. Like Jeff, Marissa, Eric all purposely created a way for them to continually be inspired by people who are different from them. You have to set time aside from it and really defend it because goodness knows your to-do list is never finished. But you have to really protect that deep thought work time and being exposed to different expertise than your own.
Yeah. You spoke there about, startup founders actually pushing themselves out and, you know, bit of discomfort and trying something new. And
Mhm.
you have an amazing book called Bet on Yourself. And that exact point was the biggest takeaway that I got from the book,
Yeah.
right? Was the blockers that would be entrepreneurs put on themselves.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask you this question, what would be your advice as the best way for people to just get out of their own way, right? They want to be an entrepreneur, they want to launch something, they have a big dream. What's the best way for people to get out of their own way and to just start? Whether it be something very simple, putting a post out, or trialing a product or speaking to a customer. What's the best way for people to get out of their own way?
I think the beginning is so hard because you don't have this kinetic energy built up yet. You don't have this momentum already carrying you forward. This was really challenging for me too. After leaving Google, I worked there for 12 years, and to go out and become a entrepreneur myself and a
Yeah.
solopreneur was just like really overwhelming. So pot to kettle, because I was a victim of this myself, was to Reid Hoffman very famously said, if you're not embarrassed by your first launch, you waited too long, right?
Yeah.
So just get started. Optimize for speed over perfection.
Yeah.
That is very hard for me. Like, I love to be perfect at stuff. I hate being embarrassed. I hate looking stupid. I hate having people be introduced to me in my novice zone. But if
Yeah.
you're doing anything that's stretching your capabilities and getting you outside of your comfort zone and expertise, you're going to be in your novice zone. So, I mean, this is really hard advice to give because it's so hard to do
Yeah.
personally, but really optimize for speed over perfection. Just get started and
Mm.
start iterating. Just
Yeah.
make all the mistakes, get out there and be better today than you were yesterday. And that's a qualifier. So many people disqualify themselves because they are paralyzed by
Yeah.
fear of making a mistake or doing something very publicly not perfect.
Yeah.
So if I could give one piece of advice that I know is a hard to pill to swallow, that would be
Yeah.
it.
Tune out. Then just, as you
Yeah,
say, just go with
exactly.
it. Yeah, roll with it, and you're gonna learn. Okay. No, I
Well,
understand. I love that advice.
when speaking of my book, when it was about to be published and it's something I
Yeah.
worked on for years, my what's he called? My book agent gave me the best advice ever on
Yeah.
this. He was like, "Look, the reviews are none of your business. Like, people's opinions, how they internalize this actually is none of your business. So
Yeah.
don't be on there on Amazon refreshing," which of course I did. Of course I did. But he was like, "Okay, since I know you're going to ignore advice number 1, here's advice number 2. Write down for yourself right now, what is the worst review someone could ever write about this book? Like, what would hurt your feelings the most? What would be the most
Mm,
horrible thing for you to hear?" And so I wrote my own nastiest reviews, all the things I was terrified of people saying about it. None of them even came close to that
yeah.
worst case scenario. So I found that very therapeutic, because when someone wrote a review that I was not that excited about, I was like, well, it wasn't that. It wasn't
Yeah.
it wasn't actually that
It's that.
bad. That was their personal experience or how it did or it
Yeah.
didn't fit into their life right now. And it just really helped. So sometimes writing that like worst case scenario down takes
Yeah.
the sting out of like slightly missing the perfection bar.
Yeah.
And I've reflected on that many times since, when I've launched a million things that were not perfect, including my first book. It takes the sting out of it not being perfect. And
Yeah.
it's actually, I just want to show up and be helpful. I
Yeah.
don't want to not show up because I was waiting to be perfect.
No, I 100% agree with that, and I think that's incredibly helpful advice. I can see how you could do that with anything. You could do it with a
Yeah.
product, you could do it with a
Hmm.
service, you could do it with content. So yeah, I'm going to challenge everyone to go away and do that. Write down the
Yeah.
worst thing that could possibly come back to you. Um, Thinking about entrepreneurs and CEOs, I think the two obviously go hand in hand, and you see entrepreneurs graduate and kind of move up into CEOs, but you also see CEOs kind of come in.
Hmm.
One of the questions I had was, your work now with a wide range of CEOs in the consultancy that you do. Is there one thing that impacts, a kind of one common factor that impacts the rate of growth or the rate of innovation that you see in the companies that they then lead?
That's an interesting question. It's really hard to pick the one thing.
Yes.
And that isn't just reiterating what I've said before. I think
Mm,
much more so than like the perfect business plan. And this is where I
yeah.
feel like business schools go a little bit wrong.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer is the team, like the
Okay.
people you surround yourself with. Are they people who are similarly aligned in the change you're
Mm,
trying to make? Are you surrounded by innovative thinkers?
mm,
Are they people who inspire you to be better than they were yesterday? That to me is a much bigger indicator of success than your
mm.
business plan.
Yeah,
I can tell you so many examples of like incredible, patent worthy, incredible innovation that's happened. But when you don't have the right team behind you, it doesn't get off the ground, doesn't have
100%.
the impact. Whereas I've seen kind of mediocre business plans with exceptional teams skyrocket. So if I
Yeah,
had to pick one or the other over the other, I would pick a world-class team. Now,
yeah,
the natural second question is like, okay, Anne, sure. How on earth am I going to attract those people when I have no money, when I'm just
yeah.
getting started, right? So that goes back to my advice around finding people who are similarly aligned in the changes they're trying to make in the world. If they're so driven for those similar kind of results, they're going to be much more aligned with your long-term results with
Mm,
that, and you'll avoid the short-termism. Whereas if you're
yeah,
just incentivizing people with a really big salary today, you're not aligned in the long run. So I will get a
100%.
team that's really aligned with kind of the grit and drive that you need, and very passion aligned with the change you're trying to make in the world,
Yeah.
and surround yourself with as many of those people as possible.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough in terms of the importance of team people, especially you meet early stage startups all the time and there's a lot of work that's gone into a plan or a model,
Yeah.
whatever it may be. But actually in terms of the thought process around how do I find talent and what does talent
Hmm.
even look like, to kind of come in the team, that's always a big gap.
Yeah.
And this has been amazing. Thank you so much for just dropping so many gems, so much insight. Um, where can people find you? Where can they find the book? How can they connect with you?
Oh, I love that because this has been a really enriching conversation between the two of us, but I love getting engagements online. So please do reach out. So best way is through my website, annhiatt.com, which is ANNHIATT.com. I have a lot of free resources there. So there's a lot of like sheets and summaries and articles and things that my entrepreneurs and scaling CEOs can utilize today. And I also post a lot on LinkedIn, and I'm very active on LinkedIn. So feel free to message me there. I post 3 or 4 articles and tips and playbooks there every single week. So that's a great place for engagement as well.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, Anne, thank you very much for your time.
A pleasure. Thanks, Sam.